This is PlainSpoken, and I'm Jeffrey Rickman. I took a couple weeks off because I needed to, and now I'm back, and I have a number of things to talk about today that I think are helpful. This is a show that I started about a month ago, a little bit more than just thinking that there are a lot of people talking, but very few people representing the concerns of small, rural churches. And a lot of people just feel like they're at the whims and mercies of a lot of bigger powers that they don't understand. I just think it's good to talk through things so that we understand, especially within the United Methodist Church, the different powers that are at play above us and around us. So it's my hope that as people watch this show and consider these topics, consider the guests that I'll turn to here in a bit, that you would be encouraged, that you would feel informed about these topics, and that you would feel equipped to more faithfully participate in the connectional nature of the United Methodist Church. So, I hope this is a blessing to you. I always begin with a Wesleyan reflection, and so today we are picking up on John Wesley's sermon, The Good Steward. And in this, he talks about the final judgment, and we live in an era where a lot of people talk about the judgment metaphorically or don't talk about it at all because it makes them uncomfortable. John Wesley talked about the final judgment quite a bit in this particular sermon. I'm not going to read the fullness of what he says, but I just wanted to give you a taste of how seriously he took this final judgment. So this is in his third Roman numeral, point 2. The time then when we are to give this account is when the great white throne comes down from heaven, and he that sitteth thereon, from whose face the heavens and the earth flee away, and there is found no place for them. It is then the dead, small and great, will stand before God, and the books will be opened, the book of Scripture to them who were entrusted therewith, the book of conscience to all mankind, the book of remembrance likewise, to use another scriptural expression, which had been writing from the foundation of the world, will then be laid open to the view of all the children of men. Before all these, even the whole human race, before the devil and his angels, before an innumerable company of holy angels, and before God, the judge of all, thou wilt appear without any shelter or covering, without any possibility of disguise, to give a particular account of the manner wherein thou hast employed all thy Lord's goods. So he goes from there on, talking about the different goods that God has given you, and he'll examine you for each of them. How didst thou employ thy soul, thy understanding, thy memory, they're in italics here, thy will, thy affections, thy thoughts, thy body, your tongue, your sight, your knowledge, your hearing. He goes through a long list. I'm gonna end the quotes there, but it seems to me that we would do well to meditate upon those things that the Scripture suggests and our tradition focuses on in its original parts. There was a huge concern for how it is that we will face the final judgment. And indeed, to be a Methodist in the beginning, you didn't have to have any doctrinal position. You had to, have one, a desire to flee from the wrath to come. And if that doesn't suggest final judgment, I don't know what does. So good Wesleyans, in the vein that I follow, in my opinion, view their participation in their local church and their denomination in the world in light of the fact that they are going to be judged according to their thoughts, their deeds, their actions with respect to these things, and that on that day of judgment there will be nothing hidden. There is nothing hidden that is not going to be made known. There is nothing concealed that will not be revealed. And so we do our best to live in the light now, so that on the day of judgment we're not scandalized whenever what we've done in the darkness, said behind closed doors, we don't want to be scandalized and embarrassed by that. We don't want to be judged by that. So that'll be the end of my reflection, and now I just want to introduce my guest. This is Brian Mangan. You pronounce it Mangan, right?
Yes, Mangan.
Yeah, I don't know that I've ever heard it said out loud. Brian and I, we travel in the same circles. We probably hold a lot of beliefs in common, and we surely don't in some areas, as is natural.
Yep.
But I've known that Brian is a friend in faith for some time, and so he was one of the people that I naturally turned to whenever I thought of having on this show. So, Brian, thanks for joining me.
Well, thanks for having me, and thanks for changing up your schedule a little bit to fit mine.
Yeah, well, I just think it's a great joy to sit down with other people and learn from them. I don't imagine that I have the fullness of the knowledge that I need pertaining to any given subject, and you have a body of knowledge and experience to draw on that I don't. So you came ready. I don't always do my best to let my guests know what I'm going to be talking about. I let him know about 5 of the 6 things I'm hoping to talk about, and I gave him and myself a pep talk before this. We're going to try and keep it to 8 minutes a pop on each topic. So with that said, forgive us if we go longer. But the very first topic I wanted to talk about was the United Methodist set up on abortion. And so the very first thing that called my attention to this was an email that got sent out from the General Board of Church and Society. So I'm going to maximize it on my screen here. And it's a pretty short document. And I blanked out who it got sent to. I'm not on their mailing list. And I've already talked enough. So, Brian, why don't you read, starting there, the Supreme Court.
So it says the Supreme Court is back in session today, which underscores the challenges we face as a result of the reproductive rights rollback made in June. Women across the United States are now being forced to give birth, many without access to adequate health care due to the lack of Medicaid expansion. Among industrialized nations, the U.S. has the highest rate of people dying of pregnancy-related complications. Black women are disproportionately affected as they are 3 to 4 times more likely to die in childbirth than white women. These facilities are largely preventable with access to affordable, quality, and comprehensive health care. Will you join our efforts with a donation today to support our work? With your help, Church and Society has been advocating to expand access to affordable and equitable care by closing the Medicaid coverage gap. By partnering with ecumenical and interfaith partners and calling United Methodist to action, we have sent letters to Congress, met with senators and representatives, written articles for national publication, and helped organize press conferences to demand justice for childbearers without insurance or access to affordable coverage. We lament for the 2 million people who remain without access to adequate health care in this nation. We lament for the mothers who have put their lives on the line to bring forth life in spaces that do not prioritize their survival.
Okay, well, I think that closes it out there. It's just a final plea for giving there. Now, the reason that I brought this up is I wondered how it struck you. You're familiar with the denominational stance on abortion and the different social stances that we've taken. My understanding is that the General Council conference that meets every 4 years for our denomination, they set the priorities for the GBCS and all of our general boards. I didn't recall this particular concern being something that we've commissioned them to do.
No, but it's definitely something that they have been advocating for a while. I've been in the United Methodist. I've been a United Methodist pastor for 31 years, and I can remember probably 10 or 15 years ago, somewhere in there, that I went to look on the General Board of Church and Society's website, and all I found were positions and lobbying for abortion, and not one statement, not one support for adoption. And I think that's what I went on to the website originally for. If I remember right, was looking for, what were the adoption resources we have? What were we doing as a church to promote that and support adoptive families? And
surely there's some statement that our denomination's made on adoption.
There is. It's right after the statement on abortion
within the social principles.
Yeah.
So go ahead and would you mind sharing that?
Sure.
Because I know you came prepared for that.
Yeah.
So go ahead and read the statement on abortion, and we'll pause for a second, and then the statement on adoption.
Yeah. I'm just going to read the first 3 paragraphs because the one on abortion is quite detailed. Once it gets past the first 3 paragraphs, it goes into different things
scenarios.
Different scenarios.
Okay.
But it's paragraph, or it's K in our social principles, paragraph 161. And of course, we're still using the 2016 Book of Discipline. We won't,
Okay.
But it says, abortion, the beginning of life and the ending of life, are the God-given boundaries of human existence. While individuals have always had some degree of control over when they would die, they now have the awesome power to determine when and even whether new individuals will be born. Our belief in the sanctity of unborn human life makes us reluctant to approve abortion. But we are equally bound to respect the sacredness of life and well-being of the mother and the unborn child. We recognize tragic conflicts of life with life that may justify abortion, and in such cases we support the legal option of abortion under proper medical procedures by certified medical providers. We support parental, guardian, and other responsible adult notification and consent before abortions can be performed on girls who have not yet reached age of legal adulthood. We cannot affirm abortion as an acceptable means of birth control, and we unconditionally reject it as a means of gender selection or eugenics. And, what I see in that email and what I've seen from past lobbying from the General Board of Church and Society is how they define, the statement here, I think that's important, is that we recognize tragic conflicts of life with life that may justify abortion. But what do we mean by life? And what do we mean by tragic conflicts of life versus life? I kind of take the approach towards abortion of maybe like just war theory, and just war theory has these 7 principles that say, yes, taking of life, human life is a tragic thing, but here are 7 principles at which it might be justifiable. And, and we all have that belief or some kind of belief that says, if somebody is trying to take your life, then you have a justifiable reaction to maybe take theirs before they take yours. And so I can agree to the point about this conflict of life versus life. But I think where we get into differences is what do we mean by a conflict of life? And
one of the articles I sent out for consideration was a commentary by Holly. I don't know if that last name is pronounced Fugate, but I found this. It's as though she actually just read the social principles comments that you just did, and that she came out with a statement where she rejoices in the Dobbs decision. So that statement that we just read from GBCS calls it a removing of reproductive rights. Here, she sees this in a more nuanced light, where the Dobbs decision revoked a constitutional right to kill sacred human life, which our social principles affirm, that all unborn life is sacred. But then she acknowledges there are such things like ectopic pregnancies, where the mother's, if that pregnancy comes anywhere close to term, that mother will not survive. In which case, the conservatives I follow say there really isn't any scenario where you have to kill unborn life, but you can prematurely deliver unborn life and let nature take its course, which is much more humane in my eyes. But I think what you were building up to was saying there are a number of women who say, my life will virtually end if you make me have this baby. My life as I know it will be over, and you cannot make me take this baby to term.
Well, and I think
my job will be over, my relations will be disrupted.
And what I've heard is it's a diminishing of the flourishing of life, that anything that diminishes life from flourishing, and by that they would mean, get in the way of a job, get in the way of whatever, then that is the conflict there. And I know in 2012 at General Conference there was we don't call them bills, but there was legislation that didn't make it out of committee that wanted to put the word physical here, physical life.
Oh, really? I didn't hear that.
Yeah, and there was a hand vote done in committee, and my understanding was that this hand vote was fairly close, but the chair of the committee didn't call for an actual vote, just went by the show of hands, and based on their determination of the show of hands, they felt that
it didn't have enough support.
It didn't have enough support, and it didn't make it out of committee.
Well, and I think something that happened in 2016 was that GBCS had formally affiliated with RCRC, Reproductive Choice was one of the Religious Commission on Reproductive Choice, which advocated for abortion up to the moment of delivery. And the denomination as a whole said, no, cut them off. And then GBCS, through a hissy fit, issued a public statement saying this was unjust for.
Yeah.
And then we also made a statement saying, you know what, GBCS, if you want to talk about church and society, talk about the persecuted church, talk about Christians being persecuted. And they haven't said anything about it, to my knowledge, since we commissioned them to do that. And then whenever the Dobbs decision came out, something we hadn't pointed attention to yet was they made a response, an official statement against the Supreme Court for making that decision, which is a decidedly far left-leaning position. And then a resource you pointed me to was Reverend Dwayne Anders wrote he took a posture of like a reasonable middle place where look at we value the life of the unborn and the life of the mother, but in the end he seems, in my opinion, to come down entirely on that.
And it comes down to that, anything that would seen as a diminishing of the status of the mother is a diminishing of life, and that's the conflict of life versus life that justifies abortion. But you know what really bothers me about the email that I read is that it clearly does want to equate abortion with birth control. You know, and that in our statement in the social principle again, you know, says we find it unacceptable as a means of birth control.
Yeah, one of the conservative position is decidedly this is a human life. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. You know, there is no uncertainty. This is a human life, and also an approach to freedom where a liberal approach to freedom is I should not be constrained by anything. And so this baby will constrain me. It will limit my possibilities in life. A conservative approach says life is constraint, and there's freedom in navigating that constraint. But humans become very ugly creatures when we try to remove all boundaries, all constraints in our lives.
Well, and that brings me to the place that I don't know. It's an itch that I have a hard time scratching. And that is how our society has, on a whole, viewed this choice as either the mother has to abort the child or raise the child, and we do not talk about adoption. I mean, and I remember this is the reason why I went to look for Adoption Now resources. I was volunteering some time at a local pregnancy crisis center.
Really?
And you know, and they were, you know, they'd show me the materials and what they do to convince the mother about, you know, not having an abortion.
Right.
They had their own sonogram.
Have you seen that we went and did a tour of an abortion or a
crisis
pregnancy center in Owasso?
Well, that was the one I was volunteering at.
Is it really? Oh my goodness. Okay, so we went and did a tour there. It's really good. So I want to come back and talk about. Go ahead.
What I was surprised by it though is I asked them about, so when do you bring up adoption, or do you talk about adoption? And I was told they don't talk about adoption. It's either
really
abortion or raising the child yourself. And I was surprised that adoption wasn't even something that was mentioned, because it seems to me that seems to be if this pregnancy is going to be is a diminishing of the welfare of the mother in terms of economic or social status or something along those lines, wouldn't adoption be a better place to go? You know, I mean,
so that anybody watching this knows, Brian actually did adopt a child. So in the interview portion of this, that's going to be part 2. If you want to hear Brian's story and how he walked through this, go ahead and watch that. So that's when we'll read the social principles on adoption as well. So anything else to be said about abortion before we move on?
Oh, probably.
There's a lot to be said.
I should probably stop while I'm ahead, right?
Well, let's move on to the next topic, because I've kind of made it a pet project of mine to understand the African context in the United Methodist Church, and I'm very far from being an expert on all this. I've had 2 interviews so far, hoping to do several dozen. I'm hoping to put them out over time for other people to learn from and see. But people over here have known it's complicated over there for a while. A few weeks ago, there was a statement put out by some African bishops saying the Africa Initiative, the Wesleyan Covenant Association and the Global Methodist Church are responsible for trying to split the church in Africa. They are now no longer welcome to be active in these regions in Africa. Last I checked, there are 3 central conferences in Africa, divided under at least 13 bishops. I was looking at this earlier today, and I've forgotten already.
Yeah,
but then
we have far more bishops and fewer church members in the United States than they do in Africa. I will say that.
So there are more African United Methodists than there are American United Methodists. However, that's not necessarily reflected. The Africa Initiative came back with a response saying, it's not our intent to divide the church. We're just trying to circulate information and let churches be informed. And so I've been trying to talk with different people in Africa to say, okay, how do you see us? And then how do you see yourselves in the whole denominational setup? And it's way too broad for an 8-minute segment here. But I did want to focus on this article by David W. Scott, and he writes for UM News from time to time. That's him right there. I've noticed him having a very nuanced and unbiased perspective, which is nice. And he's been writing on, in particular, what it seems to me the Nigerian perspective seems outsized in comparison. And it's not that we never hear anything, but the conflicts in Nigeria sure take center stage. And a lot of the key players are in Nigeria. So another group, Africa Voices of Unity, the main guy that I've been talking to there is Nigerian. And you would think, okay, the ones against the Africa Initiative. Africa Initiative is very conservative, so Africa Voices of Unity must be very liberal, right? No, they're both very conservative, not just with human sexuality, but biblical interpretation. But there's a genuine question on their part of, do we move forward by working well with the evangelicals, splitting off? That would be Africa Initiative, WCA, GMC. Or do we do better to cooperate with the institution, which will then pass something like a Christmas covenant and let them have regional autonomy? So this article by Mr. Scott here, he's probably a doctor. He talked about this gathering in Nairobi in May where the Africa Initiative dealt with some of these tensions, but the one I really wanted to focus on was they really want to see some more bishops put in place over there. They're raising this concern that I think the Africa Voices of Unity would as well. I wanted to share this quote from.
I think is it that like us, their bishops are because General Conference hasn't met, they haven't elected bishops to so they have retiring bishops and they have bishops that are going past retirement like we've had.
Well, and they have one who died, who orchestrated the protocol. But even so, what happened in the U.S. was we weren't supposed to be able to bring in new bishops until General Conference, and the Judicial Council got involved and said, oh, no, we can do it here. But they didn't do that for the central conferences.
Yeah, I agree. That seems a little...
That's weird.
Yeah.
So here's the things that Ande is the Africa Voices of Unity person that I've been talking to. He lifts up 4 things that are representative of, I don't think he says racism. I don't know that he even says neocolonialism. I should have read this before. But there are 4 things. 1, what is the total membership of UMs in the Western jurisdiction, and how many bishops do they have compared to Africa as a whole? Is there equality in the way bishops are distributed in the United Methodist Church? So we already talked about that one too. Look at the boards and agencies we have. How many Africans serve in the boards or work in those agencies? Is there equality in that distribution? And the answer is no. 3, look at the United Methodist universities and colleges. How many do we have in Africa compared with America? I think there's actually, isn't Gumbaranga where Jerry Kula is? And I want to say there's a third too. But even so, look how many are in the U.S.
13 in the U.S.
And that's just the official ones. We have money involved in a lot more. And then 4, when the WCA tells the UMC members to stop paying apportionments, who do you think that will affect? Think about the schools, hospitals, other, I don't know what he said there, people in Africa that depend on that apportionment. Is that what you call equality? I could go on. And I wish he would. I think it would be really helpful to be thinking about that. But when we imagine, I think right-leaning people like to imagine we're on the side of the Africans. We agree. We share in that theology.
I think that next paragraph, though, is the most telling and the most accurate.
Well, I've read enough. Go ahead and say
it. It says, many people in America think Africa is one country. Such myopic thinking translates to how they relate with Africans. We have been treated as less human, even by the church. I went to Wesleyan Theological Seminary in Washington, D.C., and I can recall encounters in America where as a black person, I was treated differently. We see how our black siblings in Africa are being treated by both the far right and the far left. Where is equality in all these things?
Yeah, yeah.
And I'm not as informed as I would like to be in Africa, on Africa, but yeah, we forget that it's a continent with multiple countries, not a nation on its own, and each country has its own thinking, and we forget also that the colonial powers did set up a lot of the boundaries of these countries, and they did so without regard to what were already established tribal territories. And so in some cases, you had you had tribes that were divided among different territories and put into different countries. And, that was the origin of the Rwanda genocide in the 90s, was this tribal conflicts and the tribalism that's, still kind of undermines a lot of the thinking in society there. But and I think in terms of, should they remain United Methodist? Should they go Global Methodist? Should they do their own thing? I mean, a lot of that also comes down to national laws, and are they in a country that has to recognize officially the churches that operate in that country? And so if you change your denomination, now you're no longer a legal church. You see that can be a factor. And I think it is a matter of trust. They've and lack of trust. But yeah, I mean, parts of the Christmas covenant I actually can support, because I mean, let's face it, General Conference is very United States focus.
Right, and the Christmas covenant gives regional autonomy to different parts of the United Methodist Church, where they can have different doctrines to one degree or another.
Let's just go back to our last topic with the General Board of Church and Society. They're advocating on something that is only affecting, the United States, and not speaking and not advocating. I mean,
they would say it affects other parts of the world, but even so, I mean, with that and the gender ideology, these are concerns that are very outsized in the Western culture. And then in Africa, one gentleman I was talking with yesterday, he said, look, it's a much bigger if you want to talk about sexual ethics, we want to talk about polygamy here. We need to figure that out. If you want to talk about threats to quality of life, we want to talk about religious persecution here. We have dire poverty issues that we're still dealing with. You're talking about getting people on government health care over in North America. We're just talking about keeping people alive over here. You're talking about how different ethnicities die at slightly higher rates. Well, they say 3 to 4 times. When you look at that actual data, actual numbers, it's not the genocide that you might be led to believe. It's not that we should be indifferent about it, but we should be interested in all those other causal factors that are involved in maternal mortality rates, and how they correspond with culture and race. But we've already moved on since that topic. When we're talking about African concerns, they're not the same as Western concerns. And so do we split off and allow people to focus on their own concerns, or do we seek the same mind that was in Christ Jesus?
Yeah, and that's my point was just trying to be, is that a general agency of the church is focused on a topic for the United States and not for the general church.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And that seems to be that's our inherent structure from the beginning, that we're focused on the United States, and we do tend to neglect not just Africa, but Europe and the Philippines, the other parts of the United Methodist Church. And although I would like to see us have more of a one mind approach, that an equality approach where we're all parts of the world are somehow
how do we imagine that we're following the Bible if we allow for regional and ethnic separation within the church? That just seems to be such a clear, and it's not like we're a pure and perfect church now, but it seems to be moving in the wrong direction if we allow for that regional separation. But it's for the sake of short-term political convenience and just getting our way, and that's just short-sighted and selfish. And but I mean, to find Africans also being sympathetic with it just is a statement on how distasteful we have become. And this gentleman I spoke with yesterday, I said, is neocolonialism a real thing happening over there? Is that a concern? And he said, not really. You know, if you want to talk about colonialism, let's talk about rape and gunpowder. And but if you're talking about just hostile ideology, look at ideology that is not already in Africa that is being brought in from the West. And then he pointed me to this article that I've got on my screen here. Bishop dedicates reconciling church in Kenya. For many people, this is indicative of neocolonialism. One guy called, well, I'm not going to say what he called it, but this is evidence of Western intervention in African culture. But right-leaning caucus groups, which got all the attention from the bishops, if they're facilitating a conversation on separating, is that neocolonialism or something else? And so I don't know what else. I will have an informed position on this maybe next week, but I doubt it. Let's move on to the next topic. It's from this article that I saw being posted on the United Methodist Clergy page. And it's not a United Methodist particular article. It's on Patheos, but that's religious topics. Pastors are quiet quitting the church. And I'm ashamed to say I'd heard quiet quitting referred to before, but I didn't really know exactly what it was. And I was disturbed by the conversation that followed. Did you see this on Facebook? Did you see me lock? I locked horns with one guy who said, quiet quitting is just doing your job. And then when you go above and beyond for your job, you're just making it harder for any other pastors that are not as privileged as you to be able to do that. You know, some of us, we really are hard up for money, and we need to do what I would call the bare minimum. They say we just need to do what's required in our job, and anything beyond that is volunteering. It's not our job.
No, I didn't. I read the article even before you sent it to me, and I had heard of the Great Resignation and the quiet quitting in the corporate world, and I would say that there are several things. You know, again, I've been a pastor for 31 years in the United Methodist Church, and there were several things in this article that, I mean, I could resonate with in my own ministry at times.
Let me give this definition just right here. It's on the screen. Quiet quitting is when you keep your job, but you don't do anything more than is expected of you. So what did you identify with in this article?
Well, I mean, the idea that you go out there, I mean, you know, being a pastor, we also have a call, and with a call often comes a passion.
Sure.
And so you're out there and you're trying to bring that to the church that you're serving, and you just, you know, at best you just get blank faces back at you, and you know, I'm not going to say how recently, maybe within a few months, I was like, why am I even doing this? Because they don't seem like this is what they want, you know, and yeah, I think I don't. If you've been a pastor for any length of time and you haven't thought that,
then you're very blessed.
Yeah, yeah, I guess so.
Well, so I would consider myself. There have been many years. I've been in ministry for almost 11 years now, and there have been years where people's eyes are glazed over, and I'm just like, "What are we doing here?" But I've been here. This is the longest appointment I've ever had, and it's like, excuse me. They're not indifferent anymore. They're not burning on fire yet, but we're coalescing is the word I would use, and that's been exciting and comforting to me. I at one point did not think much of long-term appointments at all, and now having seen the benefit of helping build a group identity, I see that.
Oh, it takes a minimum of 3, maybe 4 years to just find out and learn about the congregation. And you know, that first year of ministry and a new appointment is, I mean, it's I don't want to say wasted, but until you've gone through a full year with the church, I mean, there are all kinds of hidden surprises and things that you won't know about until you experience it. I mean, that's where it's, you know, until you've been with that church for a full cycle, those kind of surprises, those traditions.
Well, the thing this author, he focused on so the first one is pastors are notoriously underpaid. 2, churches discourage pastors from taking vacation time.
Well, I will say I think sometimes pastors discourage themselves too, but
3, constant criticism is another reason. for pastors quiet quit when their congregations don't give them the breathing
Yeah.
space they need to grow.
Yeah.
Those are the four main areas. So for me, I can affirm that some pastors aren't underpaid.
Yeah.
I can affirm that some pastors are discouraged from taking vacation time. And I've been in settings where I was criticized too much, and when I didn't have space to grow. But what I believe is that that's on me.
Yeah.
I need to assert this is what I need. Church, you need to make room for it. And if the church is not willing, then I need to find a new church. But it's not everybody needs to give me space. It's more like this is a dysfunctional situation that we need to augment together. But the quiet quitting thing seems so passive aggressive to me.
It is.
And not adult.
And trust me, I've followed the pastor that has quit before, and come into a church situation, and that affects the church, and we've all, I don't know, I've been a part of very small churches and very associate pastor of a large church, so I've experienced the dynamic of ministry through Oklahoma, and there are those churches that they have just kind of gotten to that place where all they really want is a chaplain who is going to make them feel good on Sunday morning and be there for their funeral, and
marry, carry, and bury them.
Yeah, and there's plenty of pastors that I think are willing to do that, unfortunately. But I'm one that's been, my passion is the kingdom of God and seeing it done on earth as it is in heaven, and I try to bring that as I can in different ways. And let's face it, this last I've been in the current appointment I'm in now for 6 years, and it seems like every time I get some momentum going, something's happened. I'm in the appointment for 2 years, and something called COVID hit. And all momentum. We were starting to gain some momentum in that, and then now we lost it all. Now we're just kind of recovered from that. It's like starting the appointment all over again. Really, it was coming back from COVID and all, and we're starting to find, the changes. What we thought were temporary changes are now permanent. It seems like, but we've gotten used to it, and now we're feeling like maybe some momentum is coming up, and now different conversations in the denomination are maybe affecting momentum again. And so,
well, when we're looking at general trends within the American church, not just the United Methodist Church, but I mean the mainline church is declining faster than a lot of traditions. The United Methodist Church has been in free fall now for at least 10 years, and it was in decline consistently before that. The Lewis Center puts out an annual report on clergy age trends in the United Methodist Church, and you can pull it up online for free. It comes up with some highlights. Young elders are in decline to record low number. There's some shifting from older to middle-age elders, though. That's interesting. Young deacons are increasing, but local pastor numbers decline, including young local pastors. So it goes on to a lot more factors in there, but the general story is, though the general church is declining, it would seem that the profession of clergy is declining even faster. I don't know actually which one is declining more, but you would think that churches would be closing and people would still be called to ministry, but really we're struggling to get.
Well, and I think what's missing in those statistics is I don't remember what the number is, but the rate of persons who leave ministry after just being in it for 5 years. I mean, that's pretty high as well. I mean, and I think there are a number of factors. I mean, one factor that I think affects that is, being a pastor is a pretty lonely job because, it really is. I mean, in all the appointments I've served, there's only one appointment where my wife feels like she was accepted for herself and not as the wife of the pastor. Where she felt like she was making genuine friends as friends and not, we've had friends in every church, but it's still that dynamic of, well, you're the pastor's wife or you're the pastor, and not just you're Brian, you're Gail.
Yeah.
You know, and you know, it wasn't a friendship. I guess it felt like a friendship of equals. I guess, you know.
Right.
And
well, we've been
yeah.
told as clergy to have a clinical relationship with our people. So how do you have genuine friendships in a clinical environment? And the answer is you don't.
Yeah.
You know, when we're looking at how impersonal and lonely the pastoral profession is, I think that's something that clergy did to ourselves.
Well,
I don't think it's something that churches have done to us. I think it's something that this article, this author of Quiet Quitting, he puts on to. But my comment on Facebook was, I grew up in the era when giving pastors space meant buying them a house across town, which a lot of churches did.
I've had the parsonage across the street.
Well, I live right next to the church, and I love it because there's this decision pastors have to make of, is this going to be a profession for me or a life calling for me? And that's not the same thing. A profession is clinical, it's limited. You put all these boundaries on. With a life calling, you're vulnerable to these people, and you expect them to be vulnerable to you. And you can tell I'm drawn to this one. I don't care about all the professional stuff. You know, I do it to make my higher ups happier. But my wife needs real friends, and she has them here. She has a women's discipleship group where those ladies share. They do life together. I got a men's discipleship group does the same thing. I don't know how pastors do it without this, but there are some pastors, all they do is programming, people moving, pew filling, and they're all about that final action of send them out, get them doing something. There's something to be said for just basking in God's glory together, growing in discipleship together, and then letting flow from that the things that we do communally. But so many pastors, they want the good photo op, they want the good important mission, but they don't necessarily know, they don't even know necessarily how to just sit with their people, be with their people, share in life together, do life together. I just think those are two very different models of ministry. And one is depressing for like there are a lot of people who are depressed, and it's like, dude, you're doing it in a way that's going to set you up to be depressed, you know? So you need to augment, instead of quiet quitting. Quiet quitting just feels like the most hateful thing to me. What happens if a pastor has something akin to a midlife crisis, just going, I thought I had the right boundaries here, but I'm miserable. So let's shake it up a little bit. Let's be more intimate, you know?
Well, there are a lot of moral failures in ministry, I think, because of that, actually. But, you know, you reminded me, when you were speaking, I was reminded of a quote that was from Fred Craddock. And I can't remember the exact quote itself, but basically he was talking about seminary students and what is the difference between, you know, what happened in seminary when a student came in full of fire, full of passion for God, and 3 years later, I should date the quote, it seems like it's 4 years now for seminary, right, for most people, but 3 or 4 years later, they come out and that passion is gone, and the liberalism of the seminary usually gets the blame for that, but Craddock said he felt that these were the persons who substituted talking about God for talking with God.
Okay.
And that there is that personal responsibility we have to our own discipleship, to our own relationship with God. And if we don't make that a priority for ourselves, who will?
Right.
And if we're not operating out of that priority, then I think you are more likely to run into those factors of quiet quitting. Because, I mean, to be honest, those times when I felt like, well, maybe, I could relate to those are also times when I wasn't taking care of my personal relationship as intentional. And that's been something that I've been doing very well, actually, in the last 4 or 5 years, you know, even through COVID. I mean, but one of the best things I did in 2017 was get a spiritual director and meet with them regularly.
Interesting.
And you know, that just kind of helps keep that in the forefront. And then I try every 6 months to put myself at a conference that I know is going to feed my soul.
Sure. Yeah.
And usually the church has realized that when I come back from one of those conferences the next Sunday, look out, because it's going to, you know, I can't contain the sermon anymore.
Well, clergy friends, if you're watching this and you are miserable in your job, think about Brian's approach, which is going to conferences that'll pick you up every 6 months, getting a spiritual director. Let's move on. Let's talk about hurricane recovery. Every time there's a hurricane, every time there's a natural disaster, there's I was going to say obligatory, but I don't think it's obligatory. I think UM News genuinely rejoices in the work of disaster recovery that our denomination does. I think
The United Methodist Committee on Relief is the
Yeah,
best thing we do.
UMCOR, well, and as our
a
denomination has split
denomination,
apart more and more
yeah.
ideologically, the one thing we come together on still is mission. And so UMCOR is given top-notch rankings by everyone who watches, who does this stuff. I sent you this John Stossel report he did on hurricane recovery and false information that gets promoted, one of which being that the federal government is not actually very effective in disaster recovery, but nonprofits like UMCOR do an excellent job.
Well, I would say, one of the things I felt the government did right in Katrina recovery, at least in the Alabama area, was UMCOR was designated as the main agency,
Right, when FEMA couldn't come through. Yeah.
through which the government and all other, I sent mission teams. We went a couple times to Alabama. I've done mission work in Kansas, Greensburg, Kansas, after the tornado, and I mean, if you're waiting on a federal bureaucracy or a state bureaucracy to come through, well, you're going to be waiting a while. It does seem, the Baptist Relief Organization, they're usually there 30 minutes before the storm hit. It seems like, and they're real good at the front end of getting there on the ground. And UMCOR, I think where we reign, or I don't know, reign's the right word, but where we
Flourish.
Flourish
Show off.
is in the long term
follow through
and the follow through, and that we're not there for weeks or months. I mean, we're there for years at times to make sure that everything, that is one of the things on the and the way it's funded. It's not.
Yeah, and I pulled up the page here through UMCOR. We have what's called advance giving, and there's a different number for each advance purpose. But the number for hurricane recovery is 901,670, according to the GBGM thing. And I just noticed even the conservative liberal divide is resulting in other answers. This is a mailing from the WCA, and of course the WCA is huge in Florida. That's where 106 churches have individually filed suit against the bishop and the conference. And so they point to the UMCOR advance here, 901,670. I think that's the exact same one, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, that's
But then they also allow you to give directly to churches so that they can do their work as well. The WCA Florida is doing that. And then
and with the United Methodist Committee on Relief, I mean, 100% of those dollars are going to go right into that recovery. Their administration is covered by
our apportionments.
By special the 1 great hour sharing special offering.
Is that's okay? It doesn't come out of our apportionments.
They do not have apportionment funding. Yeah.
Well, that's impressive, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, and so it may be that they may be one of the most efficient general agencies of the church because of the way we fund them.
Right. Yeah. That's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, hurricane recovery, I read this book a few years ago that rocked my world called When Helping Hurts. I don't know if you've ever heard of it, but they talk about disaster relief being one of the ways in which we often come into an area and with good intentions do more harm than good. And there is a way to do disaster relief that UMCOR is actually part of the solution on, which is that long-term follow-through care. So that's something for us to feel good about.
I've read the book When Helping Hurts and have tried to base my benevolence at the local church based on some of those principles too. And I'm actually trained in a budget program that the same authors created.
Oh, cool! Really?
But for
helping without hurting.
Yeah.
Or
I can't think of the name. I've lost it, but it's their financial
Chalmers Center.
Yeah, the Chalmers Center. Their financial training for low income.
I didn't know you were trained in that. I've known another pastor, Methodist pastor, who did that.
In fact, remember I told you I visited this church before. I actually came up here for a reading group in the district where we were reading When Helping Hurts together.
Oh, cool!
But,
I didn't know y'all did that.
Yeah, that was when districts had names after cities and they're not regional names.
Well, this kind of ties into the next one a little bit because it gets into the social justice thing a bit. I guess it doesn't tie in super clearly, but I don't know much about the Philippines yet. That's probably not going to be my next project, but there was an article says church says clergywoman faces trumped up charges. And I asked the author to be friends on Facebook, and she hasn't accepted me yet. But I got questions about this because it's real interesting. The pastor's name is Glofi Baluntong, and Filipinos forgive me for mispronouncing that. But that seems to be her. Her ministry is with indigenous population here. I can't recall the name of the group off the top of my head, but the accusation that, well, it's the accusation. The argument that this article makes is that she is not at all a threat to the state, but that the state has red tagged her, accusing her of the charge of murder. The campaign of red tagging designed to silence her and other activists who support the rights of indigenous people and poor throughout the country. Now, I want to know more about this. The particulars of the charge are not stated in this.
Yeah, that's what I found missing too.
You just had a series of statements from other clergy people, especially taking. So it's kind of this intersectional justice type thing where it's concerned with indigenous people. That's an oppressed group. She's a woman. That's an oppressed group. And then to some degree, non-Catholic Methodist or Christian groups in the Philippines are. It doesn't really talk about that in here, but the story is kind of there's this hegemonic authoritarian power, which is the state, and then there's the United Methodist Church that's facing off against it. And the last thing I recall reading about the Filipino context was several years ago, the primary leader of their government was going after drug dealers, just summarily killing them pretty much. And the United Methodist clergy were trying to protect them, and they were advocating for the rights of these drug dealers. Not to be summarily killed. Now with this, I was able to reach out to one Filipino clergy and just said, why is the government threatened by clergy advocating for indigenous people? Why is that so threatening that they would trump up false charges? So before I do any more analysis, did you look at this? Did you have any responses to anything in this?
I know very little about the Philippine context. The closest I have is I had a professor in my doctorate of ministry, Luther O'Connor, who's from the Philippines, and I always thought it was interesting that he had an Irish last name, and then I learned that my last name in one of the Filipino languages is a word for good food. So
nice. Okay.
It's spelled the same as even though it's an Irish name. So he's the Filipino with the Irish name, and I'm the Irishman with the Filipino name. But I really don't know much about the context there. I mean, I know a little bit about the Philippines and the politics there, and they've had, even though it's been a quote unquote democracy, it's been more of a they've had dictatorship like governments and corruption in the past. I mean, so. I'd like to know the nature of these charges. I mean, is she directly involved, or is she being charged with murder because a group that she might have been associated with was involved in terrorist acts that killed someone? I mean,
Well, so as I started asking, so usually, even if they're trumped up charges, usually there's some kernel of truth in a lie. So not that the kernel of truth would be that she is a murderer, but is she tied to any groups that are accused of like guerrilla military tactics? So I looked up this U.S. Department of State report, the 2021 report on international religious freedom, and it's particular to the Philippines. I did not read this whole thing. However, I read parts of it. Glofi, the pastor mentioned in this previous article, is mentioned here. But there are crackdowns on all kinds of religious groups here. And if the reasons were listed, I didn't get to it. So I need to read more. But so in any context, there are global forces at work, there are spiritual forces at work, and then there are local forces at work. And we can't really speak to the local. You and I don't know the local. But we do have a history to draw on of authoritarian regimes and how they behave. Is there an authoritarian government in place there that doesn't like any competing authorities? It seems to be the case. I mean, they're not just targeting Methodists. They're targeting Muslims as well. And then I looked up, I remembered that Mark Tooley wrote this article on the the World Council of Churches and their official connection to the KGB. There's the World Council of Churches and the National Council of Churches, and both were founded in the earlier half of the 20th century, that were largely undergirded and supported by the mainline denominations.
They were both founded under the social gospel.
Rauschenbusch was the original social gospel. He was a Baptist.
Of the original liberalism, not modern liberalism, but the original.
So there's a question of how far removed they are.
Yeah.
So the IRD was started when it became known. He makes reference to it at the beginning of this article, that Marxist guerrilla groups were funded by the WCC, the World Council of Churches. Now, I tried to find an article that substantiates that, and I didn't find one. What I did find was this article on the NCC talking about their communist foundation and leanings. It begins with a quote from Rushdoony: "The beginning of true liberty is Jesus Christ, and therefore the first and last target of all subversion is biblical faith. Hence, it is that the church has been the first target of infiltration and subversion, and it is the most subverted institution in the United States today." So at the start of the 20th century, you have this global Marxist movement that was very serious, very well organized, and global in nature, as I already said, that was able to effectively infiltrate a number of institutions and effectively work for their overthrow. And even whenever the overt proletariat versus bourgeois framework fell apart in the West, they came up with new ways in which to pit people groups against one another.
Yeah.
So I can't help but wonder if there is strong Marxism within the Filipino context, or if these indigenous groups have any way become enthralled to this, because she's overtly a social justice warrior. These things overlap in the West. How much do they do in other contexts?
Yeah.
You can't have any of these assumptions going into it. So what I want to do as I read that starting article is I want to be on her side. I hate authoritarian government. I really do. But also, whenever I realize that this flag she's waving is a social justice, left-leaning one, what I wonder is, we've seen it already in dozens of contexts across the world, are we seeing authoritarianism versus Marxism? And in that case, I don't care to support either side in this.
I mean, and I need more information, because, some basic tenets of the Christian faith can be found within communism, Marxism. They take a little bit of the truth, if you will, and build
that we need to care for all people equally.
Yeah,
all people are equally made in God's
a strong,
image.
powerful political lie around it.
Sure.
But so is she truly a Marxist, or is she just standing up for those commonalities?
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Those commonalities between a Marxist and the gospel.
In which case, Reverend Balintong, I'm going to make a commitment to be in prayer for you. I sure hope that you really are just caring for the indigenous people and not at all guilty of what you're being charged of. But let's see, what was the name of this author? Gladys Mangiduyos. Would you please do a follow-up article? We're very interested to know more details about this. We want to know how to pray for this woman of God. All right, that covers all that we really have time to cover. So we were able to cover 5 things. I'll cover Christian nationalism next week, maybe. But anyway, I'm glad you joined us. I hope you learned from Brian. If you've enjoyed listening to him, I'd encourage you just to watch part 2, where we're going to learn about him and his life and his ministry. And we've already dipped our toes in a little bit. If you're at all interested in adoption, that's a big part of his story. So I'd urge you just to check that out. But if this is all we had you for, God bless you. Hope you benefit, and I'll hope to see you next week.